The sky burned orange and red as another explosion lit up the horizon, and Sergeant Kim pressed her back against the crumbling wall of the bunker and tried to catch her breath. She had been running for what felt like hours, and her legs ached, and her lungs burned, but she could not stop now, because stopping meant dying, and she had not survived 3 tours across hostile worlds, just to die in some forgotten corner of Kepler 442b. The bombardment had started at dawn, and now the sun was setting, and Kim had lost count of how many times she had almost died today. Her squad was scattered, and her communications were dead, and she was alone in a war zone with nothing but her medical kit and a sidearm that was almost out of charge. Kim was a combat medic, and she had joined the military because she wanted to save lives, not take them. But war did not care about what you wanted, and war just took and took until there was nothing left. She wiped the sweat and dirt from her face and looked around. The ruined base and everything was destroyed and burning, and she could hear the distant sounds of fighting, but here in this sector, there was only silence. The silence was worse than the screaming, because at least when people were screaming, you knew they were still alive. Kim checked her medical kit and counted her supplies, and she was running low on everything, but she had enough to help maybe 2 or 3 more people. If she could find anyone still breathing, she moved carefully through the rubble and stepped over broken equipment and shattered walls, and she tried not to look at the bodies, because looking at the bodies would make her stop, and she could not afford to stop. The Galactic Coalition had been fighting this war for 3 years now, and Kim had seen things that would haunt her forever, but she kept going because that was what medics did. They kept going when everyone else fell down. She rounded a corner and froze because something was moving in the smoke ahead, and it was big, and it was not human. Kim dropped to one knee and raised her sidearm, and her heart pounded in her chest as she watched the shape emerge from the gray clouds of ash and dust. It was massive and easily 8 feet tall at the shoulder, and it had 6 legs and thick armor-like skin that was dark purple and covered in strange patterns, and it had 6 eyes that glowed faintly gold in the dying light. Kim recognized it immediately, and her finger hesitated on the trigger. It was a Violith. Valith were legendary creatures bonded to the Threnari warriors, and the Threnari were allies of humanity in this war, and their war beasts were sacred to them and bred for 1,000 generations to be the perfect companions in battle. This one was dying. The creature took 3 more steps and then collapsed, and its massive body hit the ground with a sound like thunder, and it did not get back up. Kim stayed frozen for a long moment, and her training told her to keep moving and to find human survivors, to not risk her life for an alien creature she knew nothing about. But Kim had never been very good at following that kind of training. She stood up slowly and holstered her weapon and started walking toward the fallen beast. As she got closer, she could see the damage, and it was bad, and a plasma burn had torn through the creature's right flank, and blue-green blood was pooling beneath its body, and its breathing was wet and labored, and each breath sounded like it might be the last. Valith saw her coming, and its 6 golden eyes tracked her movement, and it tried to growl, but the sound came out weak and broken, and more like a whimper than a threat. Kim stopped a few feet away and held up her hands so the creature could see. She meant no harm. "Hey, they're big guy," she said softly, and her voice was calm and steady, even though her heart was racing. The Valith watched her, and its eyes were intelligent and afraid, and Kim had seen that look before in the eyes of dying soldiers. And it was the look of someone who knew the end was coming and did not want to face it alone. Kim took another step closer, and the creature flinched but did not strike, and it was too weak to defend itself. Now she knelt beside the massive beast and put her hand on its neck, and she could feel its pulse beneath the thick skin, and it was fast and weak and fading. "Okay," she whispered, "and I am going to help you." A sound came from nearby, and Kim spun around and reached for her weapon, but she stopped when she saw Private Park emerging from the rubble. Park was young and barely 20 years old, and he had been with her squad for only 6 months. But he was a good soldier, and Kim was relieved to see him alive. Sergeant Park called out, and his eyes went wide when he saw what Kim was kneeling beside. "And what are you doing?" Kim turned back to the Valeth and opened her medical kitty. "I'm helping," she said simply. Park moved closer, but kept his distance from the creature, and his hand stayed on his weapon. "That thing could kill you with one swipe," he said, and his voice was high and nervous. Kim looked at the dying beast and at its 6 eyes that were still watching her, and at the blood pooling beneath its body, and at the way its chest rose and fell with each painful breath. "I have handled worse," she said, and she pulled on her surgical gloves and started examining the wound. Just a big cat. Park stared at her like she had lost her mind, and maybe she had, but Kim did not care because she had spent her whole life saving lives, and she was not going to stop now just because this life had 6 legs and golden eyes. She worked quickly and assessed the damage, and it was worse than she had thought, and the plasma burn had gone deep, and there was internal bleeding, and she could see at least 2 broken ribs pressing against what she hoped were lungs. She had no xenobiology training and no species-specific equipment, and she had never even touched a Valeth before today, but she had 20 years of medical experience, and she had saved lives in conditions that would make most doctors cry. This was just another patient. Another sound came from the rubble, and Kim looked up to see a Threnari warrior pulling himself free from a pile of broken metal, and his armor was cracked, and his face was covered in blood. But he was alive. He saw the Valeth, and his eyes went wide, and he tried to stand, but his leg gave out, and he fell back. "Down, Keth," the Threnari called out, and his voice was desperate and broken. Kim looked at the dying creature, and then at the wounded warrior, and she understood. This was his bonded companion. She turned back to the Valeth and placed both hands on its massive side and felt its labored breathing beneath her palms. "Your name is Keth," she said softly, and the creature made a small sound in response. "Okay, Keth." And Kim took a deep breath and steadied her hands and looked at the wound that should have killed this creature hours ago. "Let us see what we can do." The sun had set completely now, and the sky was dark and full of smoke, and somewhere in the distance the war continued. But here in this small corner of a ruined base, a human medic knelt beside an alien war beast and refused to let it die. Kim had no idea if she could save Keth, and she had no idea if her human medicine would even work on an alien body, and she had no idea what would happen if she failed. But she knew one thing for certain: she was going to try. Kim had seen a lot of wounds in her 20 years as a combat medic, but she had never seen anything like this. The plasma burn had torn through Keth's body like fire through paper, and the damage went deep into the muscle and maybe even deeper than that, and the blue-green blood was still flowing, and Kim knew she had maybe 20 minutes before the creature bled out. She did not have 20 minutes worth of answers. Private Park knelt beside her and held a light over the wound, and his hands were shaking, but he did not run, and Kim was grateful for that. "What do you need?" he asked him. Stared at the wound and tried to think, and her brain was racing through everything she knew about medicine and biology and chemistry, and none of it was designed for this. "I need you to keep that light steady," she said, "and I need you to hand me whatever I ask for, and I need you to not panic." Park nodded, and his jaw was tight, but he held the light steady. Kim turned her attention back to Keth, and the massive creature was watching her with those 6 golden eyes, and there was fear in them, but also something else, and something that looked almost like okay. "Big guy," Kim said softly, "and I am not going to lie to you, and this is going to hurt. But I need you to stay still, and can you do that for me?" Keth made a low rumbling sound that Kim chose to interpret as agreement. She reached into her medical kit and pulled out a tube of coagulant foam, and this was designed for human blood and human wounds, but she had nothing else, and she had to try. Human blood was iron-based and red, and Keth blood was copper-based and blue-green, and the chemistry was completely different, and Kim had no idea if the foam would help or hurt or do nothing at. All she said a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening and applied the foam to the edge of the wound. Kath flinched and made a sound of pain, but did not move, and Kim watched the foam spread across the blue-green blood and waited the bleeding. Slowed. Kim let out a breath she did not know she had been holding, and the foam was working. And it was not perfect, but it was working, and that was enough for. Now she applied more foam and worked her way around the wound, and the bleeding continued to slow, and Kath's breathing became a little less labored, and Kim allowed herself a moment of hope. The Threnari warrior had managed to drag himself closer, and he was watching Kim work with wide, disbelieving eyes, and his name was Commander Relax. And his bonded companion was dying, and a strange human female was trying to save it. "What is she doing?" Relax asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Being human, Park," answered Kim. Ignored them both and focused on the wound, and the foam had stopped most of the external bleeding, but she could tell there was internal damage, and the broken ribs were pressing against something vital, and if she did not fix that, then Kath would still die. She needed to look inside. Kim had performed field surgery before, and she had cut open soldiers on battlefields and in burning buildings and in the backs of moving vehicles. But she had never operated on an alien. There is a first time for everything, she muttered to herself. She pulled out her surgical tools and cleaned them with antiseptic and took a deep breath and looked at Kath. "I need to go inside," she said, "and I need to see what is broken and fix it. And this is going to hurt a lot more than the foam, and I need you to trust me." Kath stared at her for a long moment, and then slowly, deliberately, the massive creature lowered its head and closed its 6 golden eyes. Kim took that as permission. She made the first incision, and Kath's body tensed, but the creature did not move, and Kim worked as quickly as she could and cut through the thick skin and the strange purple muscle beneath, and she followed the damage inward. The anatomy was alien and confusing, and nothing was where she expected it to be, but Kim had learned long ago that all living things shared certain basic needs, and all living things needed to breathe, and all living things needed blood to flow, and all living things needed their organs to stay where they belong. She found the problem: one of the broken ribs had punctured something that looked like a lung, and the lung had collapsed, and Kath was slowly suffocating, and Kim could see it now, and the creature was drowning in its own body. She did not have the right tools for this, and she did not have the right training, and she did not have the right anything, but she had her hands and her experience and her stubborn human refusal to let anything die. Kim reached inside Kath's chest cavity and felt the collapsed lung beneath her fingers, and it was warm and wet and strange. But it was also familiar, because a lung was a lung no matter what planet you came from. She positioned her hands carefully and began to manually re-inflate the lung, and she pressed and released and pressed and released and worked the organ back to life with nothing but touch and instinct. Relax made a choking sound. He could not believe what he was seeing, and this tiny human female had her hands inside his bonded companion chest and was bringing Kath back from the edge of death through sheer force of will. The lung inflated. Kim felt it expand beneath her fingers, and she felt Kath take a real breath for the first time in hours, and the creature made a sound that was almost like a sob. "Good," Kim whispered, "and that is good, and keep breathing. And you were doing great." She was not done yet, and she still needed to stop the internal bleeding and repair the damage and set the broken ribs. But the hardest part was over, and Kath was breathing again, and that meant Kath was fighting. Kim worked for another hour, and she used every trick she had ever learned and invented a few new ones, and she talked to Kath the whole time because she had learned long ago that patients did better when they heard a calm voice. She told Kath about Earth and about the forests and the oceans and the mountains, and she told Kath about her childhood and about her family and about the cat she had grown up with named Machi. Machi was a tabby, Kim said as she carefully sealed a torn blood vessel, as she was small and grumpy, and she used to sleep on my chest every night. And you remind me of her." Actually, Keth made a small rumbling sound, and Kim chose to believe it was amusement. She finally pulled her hands out of Keth's body and began to close the incision. And she used surgical thread designed for human skin, but it held the alien flesh together well enough, and she covered the wound with clean bandages and sat back on her heels. The worst was over. Keth was still badly hurt and still needed real medical care from people who actually knew what they were doing. But the creature was stable and breathing and alive. Kim looked down at her hands, and they were covered in blue-green blood up to her elbows, and she was exhausted, and her whole body ached. But she was smiling, told you, Kim said to no one in particular, and just a big cat relax stared at her, and there were tears on his alien face, and in 40 cycles of bonding with Kathy had never seen anyone fight so hard for his companion life. "Who are you?" he asked. Kim wiped her hands on her ruined uniform and looked at the massive creature that was now sleeping peacefully beside. "Just a medic," she said, "and just a human." The night was cold and dark, and the fires from the bombardment had finally died down, and Kim sat beside Keth and refused to sleep. She had been awake for more than 30 hours now, and her eyes burned, and her hands trembled, and every muscle in her body screamed for rest. But she could not close her eyes, because every time she looked away from Keth, she was afraid the creature would stop breathing. Private Park had found some emergency blankets in the rubble, and he had wrapped one around Kim's shoulders, but she barely noticed, and her entire world had narrowed down to the rise and fall of Keth. Chest Commander Relax sat nearby, and his leg was badly injured, but he had refused to let Kim treat him until she had finished with Keth, and now he watched her with an expression she could not read. "You should rest," he said, and his voice was rough and tired. Kim shook her head and kept her hand on Keth's side and felt the slow, steady pulse beneath the alien skin. "Not yet," she said. "Why?" Relax asked, and he sounded genuinely confused. "And Keth is stable, and you have done everything you can do, and why do you continue to watch?" Kim thought about the question, and she thought about all the patients she had lost over the years, and all the soldiers who had died under her hands despite everything she tried. And she thought about the feeling of helplessness that came with watching someone slip away, because she said finally, and because I have seen too many patients crash when no one was watching, and because I have held too many hands while someone took their last breath, and because I'm not going to let that happen too. Keth Relax was quiet for a long moment. "How are my people?" he said slowly, "and the bond between a Threnary and a Valith is sacred, and it is a connection that goes deeper than blood and deeper than bone. And when one dies, the other often follows." Kim looked at him and saw the fear in his eyes and understood. "If Keth dies," she said softly, "and you die too." Relax nodded. "Then neither of you is dying tonight," Kim said, and her voice was firm and certain, and she meant every word. She turned back to Keth and checked the bandages and listened to the creature breathing, and everything seemed stable. But Kim had learned long ago that stable could change in an instant. The hours passed slowly, and Kim talked to keep herself awake, and she told Keth and Relax stories about Earth and about humanity and about all the strange and wonderful things her species had done. She told them about doctors who had performed surgery on themselves because there was no one else, and about soldiers who had carried wounded comrades for miles through enemy territory, and about ordinary people who had run into burning buildings to save strangers. "Humans are strange," Relax said, and he sounded almost amused. Kim smiled. "And yes, we are," she agreed. Around midnight, Keth's breathing changed, and it became faster and more shallow, and Kim's heart dropped into her stomach. "No," she whispered, and "no. No, no." She threw off her blanket and leaned over the creature and checked the wound, and the bandages were soaked with fresh blood, and something had torn inside, and Keth was bleeding again. Kim did not hesitate, and she grabbed her surgical tools and opened the wound and went back inside, and her hands moved on instinct, and she found the torn vessel and sealed it, and she worked faster than she had ever worked before Keth's body started to shake, and the creature was going into shock, and its temperature was dropping, and Kim knew that if she did not do something right now, then everything she had done would be for nothing. She did the only thing she could think of. She climbed onto Keth's chest and lay down across the massive creature and pressed her body against the alien skin and gave Keth every bit of warmth she had. Park stared at her in disbelief. "What are you doing?" he asked, "keeping Keth warm?" Kim said through gritted teeth, "And body heat is the fastest way to treat shock, and I do not have any heating equipment, and this is all I have." Relax tried to stand and tried to help, but his leg gave out, and he fell back down, and all he could do was watch as this tiny human female literally threw herself onto his dying companion. Kim wrapped her arms around Keth as best she could and pressed her face against the rough purple skin and talked and talked and talked. "Come on, big guy," she whispered, "and stay with me, and you cannot give up now. And I did not spend the last 12 hours putting you back together just to watch you die, and you have to fight, and you have to keep fighting. And I know you are tired, and I know it hurts, but you have to stay with me." Keth made a weak sound, and Kim felt the creature shaking beneath Harry. "No," she said, "and I know it is hard, and I know you want to let go, but you cannot, and Relax needs you, and he cannot lose you, and you have been together for 40 years, and that is too long to give up now." She kept talking, and she told Keth about Matcha again, and about how the little cat had been hit by a car when Kim was 10 years old, and how Kim had refused to leave Matcha's side for 3 days, and how the vet had said Matcha would not make it, but Kim had not listened. And you know what Kim said, and her voice was fierce, and Matcha lived, and she lived for another 15 years, and she died of old age in her sleep, and she lived because I refused to let her go. Kim pressed harder against Keth's body and willed her warmth into the creature's. "So you are gonna live too," she said, "and because I am refusing to let you go, and that is how this works, and I am a stubborn human, and I do not know how to give up, and you are stuck with me now." The hours crawled by, and Kim did not move, and she stayed pressed against Keth's body and kept talking until her voice was hoarse, and then she kept talking. Anywhere Relax watched in silence, and tears rolled down his alien face, and he had never seen anything like this, and he had fought in 100 battles and seen 1,000 acts of courage, but nothing compared to this small human female who was fighting death itself with nothing but warmth and words. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Keth stopped shaking. Kim felt the change immediately, and the creature breathing had steadied, and the pulse beneath her hands was stronger, and when she lifted her head and looked at Keth's face, she saw 6 golden eyes looking back at her. "Hey there," Kim whispered, and her voice cracked, and "Welcome back." Keth made a sound, and it was soft and low and almost like a purr, and then slowly and deliberately the massive creature extended its rough tongue and licked Kim's blood-covered hand. Kim laughed, and it was a broken, exhausted sound, but it was real. "Yeah," she said, "and I like you too." Relax was staring at them, and his mouth was open, and he could not find words. "Velith, do not show affection to outsiders," he finally managed, and in 1,000 years of recorded history, Kim just scratched behind what she hoped was Keth here, and the creature made another purring sound. "Everyone is a sucker for a good bedside manner," she said. She was exhausted beyond words and covered in alien blood, and her whole body ached, but Keth was alive, and that was all that mattered. The sun rose over the ruined base, and somewhere in the distance rescue ships were finally approaching, and help was coming, but it was too late to matter. Kim had already done the impossible. She had saved Keth through nothing but human stubbornness and human warmth and human refusal to give up, and now as she lay across the massive alien war beast and felt its heart beating strong and steady beneath her, she knew that this was why she had become a medic, not to follow protocols and not to obey orders and not to be efficient, but to save lives, any life, every life, no matter what. 3 weeks had passed since the battle on Kepler 442b, and Sergeant Kim stood in the center of the Galactic Coalition Council chamber and tried not to throw up. She had faced enemy fire and performed surgery in burning buildings and stared death in the face more times than she could count, but nothing had prepared her for this. The chamber was enormous and built to hold representatives from 47 different species, and right now every single seat was filled and thousands of alien eyes were focused on her. Kim was wearing her dress uniform, and it was clean and pressed, and she had even managed to get all the alien blood out of her boots, but she still felt completely out of place. She was just a medic, and she did not belong here. Council had summoned her to give testimony about what had happened on Kepler 442b, and specifically about her treatment of the Valith named Keth, and Kim had spent the last 3 weeks trying to figure out what she was supposed to say. The truth seemed too simple. A voice rang out across the chamber, and it belonged to the High Arbiter and the leader of the council, and a tall, thin alien with silver skin and eyes like black pools. Sergeant Kim of the Human Expeditionary Forces, the High Arbiter, said, "And you have been called before this council to give account of your actions during the Battle of Kepler 442b. And do you understand why you are here?" Kim swallowed hard. "And yes," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. The High Arbiter nodded. "And then please tell the council in your own words what happened." Kim took a deep breath and began to speak. She told them about the bombardment, and about finding Keth in the ruins, and about the decision she had made to help a creature she knew nothing about. She told them about the surgery, and about the long night, and about lying across Keth's body to keep the creature warm. She told them everything, and when she was finished, the chamber was completely silent. The High Arbiter leaned forward. "And Sergeant Kim," he said, "and you had no xenobiology training, and no species-specific equipment, and no guarantee that your methods would work, and yet you spent more than 16 hours fighting to save a creature that was not human, and..." Why? Kim thought about the question, and she thought about Keth, and about those 6 golden eyes filled with fear, and about the way the creature had looked at her like she was the only hope in the universe, because she said simply, "And because Keth was hurt and scared and alone, and no one should have to feel like that." The chamber erupted in murmurs, and Kim could not tell if they were good murmurs or bad murmurs, and she just stood there and waited. Another voice spoke up, and it was Commander Relax, and he was standing in the Threnari section of the chamber, and his leg was healed now, and he looked strong and proud. "Permission to address the council," he said. The High Arbiter nodded and granted. Relax walked down to the center of the chamber and stood beside Kim, and she could feel the weight of thousands of eyes on both of them. "I have fought alongside many species," he began, and his voice carried across the vast hall, "and I have seen courage and strategy and sacrifice, and I have seen warriors throw themselves into battle without hesitation, and leaders make impossible decisions under fire." He paused and looked at Kim. "But I have never seen what Sergeant Kim demonstrated on Kepler 442b, he said. Relax turned to face the council. "Humans have a word for it," he continued, "and they call it compassion, and it is not just empathy, and it is not just kindness, and it is something more, and it is the willingness to suffer for the sake of another, and to give everything you have, even when you have nothing left." The chamber was silent. I asked Sergeant Kim why she risked her life for Keth. Relax said, "And I asked her why she spent 16 hours operating on an alien creature, when she could have left us both to die and found human survivors." Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, and Kim recognized it as a recording unit. "This was her response," he said. Pressed a button, and Kim's own voice filled the chamber. "Keth looked scared and alone, and no one should feel like that." The recording ended, and Relax put the device away. "Among my people," he said, "and the bond between a Threnari and a Valith is sacred, and it is the deepest connection we know. And when Keth was dying, I was dying too, and I could feel my companion slipping away, and I could feel the bond breaking, and I knew that we were both about to end." He took a breath, And then this human and this small, strange creature from a small, strange world, and she walked into the fire and refused to let us go. Kim felt tears building in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Relax, turned to face the full council. We have fought alongside humanity for 3 years, he said, and we have seen their ships and their weapons and their tactics, and we have measured their military value in battles won and ground gained. He shook his head. We have been measuring the wrong things, he said. Chamber was completely silent. Now humans do not fight because they are strong. Relax continued, and they do not fight because they are brave, and they do not fight because they want to win. He looked at Kim. They fight because they cannot bear to see others suffer, he said, and they fight because their hearts will not let them walk away, and they fight because somewhere in their strange human souls there is a voice that tells them that every life matters and every life is worth saving. Relax raised his voice. The Threnari formally request that humanity be elevated to full coalition partner status, he announced. The chamber exploded in noise, and some aliens were shouting in approval, and others were shouting in protest, and the High Arbiter was calling for order. But Relax just kept talking. Not for their weapons, he said, and not for their ships, and not for their strategy. He met Kim's eyes across the chaos. For their hearts. The vote was held 2 hours later, and it was not even close, and humanity was elevated to full coalition partner status by a margin of 41-6. Kim stood outside the chamber afterward and watched the alien sun set over the capital city, and she still could not quite believe what had happened. A familiar rumbling sound came from behind her, and she turned to see Keth approaching, and the massive creature was fully healed now and moving with the grace of her predator. Kim smiled, and hey there, big guy, she said. Keth lowered its massive head and pressed it against Kim's chest and made that purring sound that Kim had come to love. Commander Relax approached and stood beside them. You changed everything today, he said, and you know that, right? Kim scratched behind Keth's ear and shook her head. I did not do anything, she said, and I just did what any medic would do. Relax made a sound that might have been a laugh. No, he said, and you did what any human would do, and that is exactly the point. He looked out at the sunset. We have been at war for a long time, he said, and we have seen many species fight and many species fall, and we have learned to measure value and power and resources and strategic advantage. He turned to Kim. But humans have taught us something new, he said, and they have taught us that the species worth fighting beside is not the one with the biggest guns or the fastest ships. Put his hand on Kim's shoulder. It is the one that will hold your hand when you are dying and refuse to let you go. Kim looked at Keth and at Relax and at the alien sky above them, and she thought about Earth and about humanity and about all the strange, wonderful things her species had done. Maybe Relax was right. Maybe compassion was worth more than weapons. Maybe kindness was the greatest strength of all. 1 year had passed since the council vote, and Sergeant Kim stood in front of her new office at the Coalition Joint Medical Research Facility and still could not believe this was her life. Now the office was huge, and it had windows that looked out over the facility gardens, and it had her name on the door. And underneath her name were the words Director of Cross-Species Emergency Medicine. Kim had tried to turn down the position, and she had said she was just a field medic, and she did not know anything about running a research facility. But the coalition had insisted, and eventually she had stopped arguing. A familiar weight pressed against her side, and Kim smiled and reached down to scratch behind Keth's ear. The massive Valith had never left her side. After the battle on Kepler 442b, something had happened, and something that the Threnari scientists still could not fully explain, and Keth had formed a secondary bond with Kim, and it was weaker than the primary bond with Relax. But it was real, and it meant that Keth could sense Kim's emotions, and Kim could sense Keth. It also meant that wherever Kim went, Keth followed. The facility had been forced to widen every doorway and reinforce every floor and install special furniture that could support 1,200 pounds of alien war beast, But no one complained because Keth had become something of a celebrity. The creature that the humans saved was what they called Keth, and Kim had grown used to the stares and the whispers. And the constant requests for photographs. She did not mind Keth, seemed to enjoy the attention, and the massive creature had discovered that it loved having its belly rubbed, and would flop onto its back for anyone willing to provide scratches. It was ridiculous, and Kim loved every second of it. A knock came at her office door, and Kim looked up to see Private Park standing in the hallway, and he was not a private anymore, and he had been promoted to lieutenant, and he worked at the facility now. As Kim assistant, "You have visitors," Park said, "and Commander Relax is here with a group of Threnari trainees." Kim nodded and sent them in. Park stepped aside, and Relax entered the office, followed by 6 young Threnari soldiers, and they all stared at Keth with wide eyes. The young ones had heard the stories, but hearing and seeing were very different things. Kim stood up and greeted Relax with a handshake, and it was a human gesture that the commander had adopted, and he said it felt appropriate. "It's good to see you," he said. "You too," Kim replied. "And how is the training going?" Relax made a gesture that Kim had learned meant mixed results. On learning, he said, but some concepts are difficult for them to grasp." Kim nodded, and she knew what concepts he meant. Over the past year, she had been working with Relax to develop cross-species emergency protocols and training programs, and the goal was to teach alien medics how to treat species they knew nothing about. And a key insight came from what Kim had done for Keth. "Do not focus on what is different," she had told them, "and focus on what is the same. And all living things need to breathe, and all living things need blood to flow, and all living things feel fear and pain, and all living things respond to kindness." It sounded simple, but it was revolutionary. For centuries, the coalition had approached medicine species by species, and each group had their own specialists and their own techniques and their own equipment. And if you encountered a wounded alien from a species you did not know, then you were expected to call for help and wait. Kim had proven that waiting was not always an option. Kim walked over to the training group and looked at the young Threnari faces, and they were nervous and eager, and they reminded her of herself 20 years ago. So she said, "And you want to learn how to save lives?" They all nodded. "Good," Kim said, "and here is the first lesson, and it is the most important thing I will ever teach you." She paused and made sure they were all listening. "The patient is not a species," she said, "and the patient is not a biology, and the patient is not a set of organs and systems." She pointed at Keth. "The patient is a person," she said, "and they are scared, and they are hurting, and they want to live, and your job is to help them fight." One of the young Threnari raised a hand. But what if we do not know their anatomy? And what if we do not have the right equipment? And what if we make a mistake?" Kim smiled. "And those are good questions," she said, and here is the answer, and you try anyway." The trainee looked confused. "You try anyway," Kim repeated, "and you use what you have, and you adapt, and you improvise, and you do not give up, and you keep fighting until the patient stops fighting, or until you have done everything possible." She looked at each of them. "And term mistakes are acceptable," she said, "and giving up is not." Training session lasted 3 hours, and Kim walked them through case studies and simulations and hands-on exercises, and by the end of it, the young Threnari were exhausted, but they were also excited. They were starting to understand after the trainees left. Relax stayed behind, and he stood by the window and looked out at the gardens, and Kim could tell he had something on his mind. "What is it?" she asked. Relax was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking," he said finally, "and about what you told the council, and about how Keth looked scared and alone, and how no one should feel like that." Kim nodded and waited. "I have asked many humans the same question," Relax continued, "and I have asked them why they help strangers, and why they risk themselves for others, and why they show kindness to creatures that cannot benefit them." He turned to face Kim, and they all say the same thing, he said, and they all say something like what you said, and they act as if it is obvious. and as if any other response would be unthinkable, Kim shrugged. "And it is obvious," she said, "and at least to us relax." Shook his head in wonder. "And that is what I cannot understand," he said. "And for my people, compassion is a strategy. And it is something we use when it benefits us, and when it does not benefit us, we do not use." I looked at Kath, who was sleeping in a patch of sunlight. "But humans," he said, "and you show compassion even when it costs you, and even when it hurts you, and even when there is nothing to gain." Kim thought about his words, and she walked over to Kath and sat down beside the massive creature and ran her hand along the rough purple skin. She remembered her mother and how she used to take in stray animals, even when they could barely afford to feed themselves. She remembered her father and how he used to stop the car to help strangers change flat tires on the side of the road. She remembered Machi and how she had refused to give up on that little cat even when everyone said it was hopeless. "Maybe," she said slowly, "and maybe that is what makes us human." Relax tilted his head. "And what do you mean?" Kim looked up at him. "Every species has things that define them," she said, "and things that make them who they are. And for the Threnaris, it is the bond, and for the coalition, it is cooperation. And for humans," she paused and smiled, "for humans, it is the stubborn, ridiculous belief that every life matters," she said, "and that kindness is never wasted, and that compassion is not a strategy. And it is just the right thing to do." Kath stirred and opened 6 golden eyes and looked at Kim and made that soft purring sound. Kim scratched behind the creature ear and felt the secondary bond humming between them, and felt the warmth and the trust and the love. Relax watched them together, and he thought about everything he had seen over the past year, and he thought about the tiny human female who had crawled inside his companion chest and refused to let death win you. "No," he said, "and when I first met humans, I thought you were the weakest species in the coalition, and I thought you were soft and fragile and foolish." He smiled. "I was wrong," he said, "and you are the strongest species I have ever known, and not because of your bodies or your weapons or your ships." He walked over and knelt beside Kim and Kath. "Because of your hearts," he said. Kim felt tears in her eyes, and she did not try to hide them. "Thank you," she whispered. Idrix put his hand on her shoulder. "No," he said, "and thank you, and for everything." Sun set over the facility and the gardens turned gold and orange, and Kim sat with Kath and relaxed and watched the light fade, and she thought about the future. She thought about all the lives that would be saved because of what she had started, and all the species that would learn to show compassion to strangers, and all the bonds that would form between creatures who had never met. And she thought about Machi, and about her parents, and about Earth, and about all the stubborn, wonderful humans who had taught her that kindness was the most powerful force in the universe. Kath made a rumbling sound and pressed closer to Kim's side. "You know," Kim said softly, "and back on Earth, I had a tabby cat named Machi, and she was small and grumpy, and she used to sleep on my chest every night." She smiled and wrapped her arm around as much of Kath as she could reach. "You remind me of her," she said. Kath purred, and the sound was like distant thunder, and Kim closed her eyes and listened to it and felt completely at peace. Somewhere out among the stars, the war continued, and somewhere out among the stars, people were fighting and dying and suffering, but here in this moment there was only warmth, and there was only love, and there was only the bond between a human and an alien creature who had found each other on a battlefield and refused to let go. That was enough. That was everything, and that was what it meant to be human.